You're listening to the University of Sioux Falls Campus Ministries podcast.
Hi everyone, my name's Matt Stiles and I serve as the campus pastor at the University of Sioux Falls. On this podcast, we have conversations with USF staff, alumni, students, and experts in the community to help us better integrate the Christian faith into our particular field. Our focus this semester will be psychology and spiritual formation. Today on the podcast, we welcome Kent Carlson. Kent is the founding pastor of Oak Hills Church of Folsom, California, where he served from 1984 to 2016 and is currently pastor emeritus. He joined the North American Baptist Conference staff in January of 2016 in a new role, pioneering leadership formation. Kent is also the co-author of a book called Renovation of the Church. Kent now serves as a North American Baptist NorCal Regional Minister, where he works with association leaders to plant churches, develop leaders, and resource existing congregations. So Kent, I always love visiting with you and getting together, hearing your thoughts. So thanks for taking the time to sit down on the podcast this morning.
Yeah, my pleasure. I was looking forward to it.
So this season, we are focusing on the topics of psychology and spiritual formation. And that book that you co-authored with Mike, Renovation of the Church, has the subtitle, What Happens When a Seeker Church Discovers Spiritual Formation? So I'd love to hear about your process of discovery. But before we get to that, could you share a little bit about what your congregation was like before discovering spiritual formation?
Sure. The byline about when a seeker church discovers spiritual formation is not ours. That's the publisher put that in, because it's not like we didn't know spiritual formation existed in that time, and we were complete ambition-driven idiots the whole time. But so we had, way back in the 80s, I was reading Willard and learning contemplative prayer and that kind of stuff. So we had that background, and then towards the end, when we moved out of our seeker model, we were getting more in depth in the readings, not only of Willard, but of, those who have always pushed the more formational, mystical encounter with God kind of aspect of Christian history. And so we're drawn to that, which was, part of the difficulty. The muscular nature of a seeker church requires one to always be on, always surprising people, always feeding the consumeristic model that's there. And if you're successful in, quote unquote, in your own little pond, at least, it's its own reward. And so you think God's involved in all that. So before we moved into this time of refocusing on formation and discipleship, well, the first 7 years we were just, I knew hardly anything about planning a church. I just, didn't have any of the training that's typical now. And we just had fun. It was 7 years of every time we'd have a party, everyone in the church would get together. We started from scratch. So it was great. It was great fun. But then in the year right around 1990, I took a group of people to Chicago, to Willow Creek, for Willow Creek Leadership Conference. 7 of us. We called it, for those who are listening who have memory of this, we called ourselves the Chicago 7 from the 68 riots at the Democratic Convention there for president and a Democratic Convention. And these are, guys who went to jail and then eventually became Wall Street people like Abby Hoffman and those kinds of guys. Anyway, because we became rather infamous in the church after that because of the problems we caused. So we went to this conference, and all of us were impacted with this huge desire to reach non-church people. We were at that time focusing what we would refer to, and many refer to, as a kind of a truncated understanding of the gospel that prioritizes the personal salvation, so that I accept Jesus or accept some theory on the atonement. And that means now my sins are forgiven. I'm going to heaven when I die. Which, again, it's truncated because the gospel is so much more than that. I think in Scott McKnight's book, the King Jesus Gospel, he talks about when Robert Weber was asked by someone, could you give me an understanding of what the gospel is, kind of in a nutshell? And he says, do you have an hour? And so when Bill Hybels used to say, it's do versus done, what you try to do to go to heaven versus done what Jesus has done for you. So that truncated, what's the other word for truncated? It's reductionistic,
Yeah.
kind of thing. You take something that's grand and glorious and you bring it into some small little trade phrases, and in the process you reduce its meaning and its significance. So that seeker model, which is oriented around getting people to a service where things are presented to them without asking anything for them to, we used to say, you don't sign anything, give anything, say anything, sing anything, that kind of stuff. You just come and watch. And then we present a gospel, truncated gospel, where you respond to it. And then your sins are forgiven. You go to heaven when you die. If that is actually the gospel, if that's the good news, then perhaps the seeker services kind of churches are the best way of doing it. But I think less and less people, believe that. And so during the seeker days, one of my majors, one of my many failed majors was theater. And so the whole kind of drama and dance and theatrical stuff and putting on the hour and 10-minute long service was fun for me, and all the kinds of elements of that. It was like putting on a theatrical production every week. And in our little pond, Folsom, California, our church grew very, very rapidly. And one, if not the most rapidly growing church in the Sacramento area. And it was fun, again, it was in the 90s, which still did not have the juice from the whole end of Christendom thing. If you had a good garage band and if you can string sentences together that kind of make sense in some way, you could get a church. People would come, particularly in a growing area. That's just not the case anymore. So that's where we were at that point before we made the change. It was a fun, heady time for me personally. It fueled all my ambition. And this is so embarrassing, my inflated sense of how impressive I was. But it breeds that. We used to talk about that the I forget which I use for which, but it's the lighted match of ambition hits the dry timber of consumerism, and you got this huge fire that starts going that just you give people what they want and you do it in a good way and people will respond to that and you feel like you're significant in it, and that whole thing and it's rested on to a large degree on that more truncated understanding of the gospel.
Even in the opening part of your answer to that question of like in that stage, it wasn't like, oh, we've never heard of the phrase spiritual formation, and had even like read some Willard and contemplative prayer and giving like a thumbs up to some of that stuff, which a lot of times we think it's either all one way and then something hits and we go all another way. But we can be on board with spiritual formation and not realize the system that we find ourselves in reinforces ambition and all the things that deform us.
Like Lucan, for example, when he came in and was at the height of our seeker times, his title was pastor of spiritual formation. And so we knew the language, right? And we weren't like insincere about it. But you're absolutely right. We did not see significantly how the structure we had built the church around was forming people in ways contrary to what we desired.
So as you're starting to discover that, you're giving a thumbs up towards spiritual formation, and then there are things that start to poke holes in your current setup, how things are working, how you're relating to one another, how you understand the gospel, all of that. How did your congregation discover the importance of spiritual formation? And then how did that impact you, your understanding of ministry, the gospel? How did that affect you?
Well, yeah, we had this growing. I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about, okay, how do we get to 3,000 people? And on the other hand, we're talking about how do I learn to be transformed into the image of Christ in the details of my life? So different sets of questions that you have to answer at those points. And it creates a little craziness in your mind. Well, we had built This would be 2000. We had built our big building, which was just phase one of a 3 phases of this building taking over the whole footprint of buildable area. And we had a 3-year strategic plan that was all quantitative, that all the measurements were quantitative. These many people come to this, these many people, and everyone in the church all the leaders in the church and the staff were all oriented in meeting those numbers and all that embarrassingly silly stuff. But we built the building, and our assumption and our prognostications was that we would grow by 50%, and we were already pretty big. And we didn't. We grew by 25%, which in our ambition is a major emergency. We have to have a big retreat for leadership to talk about how can we do that different. And so we had this retreat where all the senior level staff and the elder board, we came together, and I asked them to read Lau Shaller's book, The Very Large Church, which was more popular in that day than it certainly is now. But it essentially says, as you grow older as a church, a larger church is not the same kind of animal, just, more efficient or whatever. So a church of 200 is a mouse, and a church of 400 is a giraffe. They're just completely different things. So as you move through there, you have to reinvent your leadership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order to accommodate that, the time, how you spend your time, et cetera. So I wanted us to have some expertise on that, talk about it, and how do we arrange, blah, blah, blah. So one of the chapters there in the book was on consumerism. And the end of the book essentially said, I don't think this is unkind. I think it's fairly close to what it actually says, but is that consumerism is the most powerful force in American culture, North American culture, Western culture, and more powerful than patriotism, more powerful than religion or whatever. It can't be stopped, so there's no use trying to stop it. And the church that wants to go has to learn how to harness that consumerism in order to grow. So when we got there, and I just said, what are the thoughts on the book? Just open-ended, almost to a person, people brought up that chapter. And there was an ongoing sense of how offended we were by it. And then somewhere in that process, I started, I don't know, I was just self-reflecting. And I started a stream of consciousness about myself and how much ambition I had, how much I enjoyed being known, how much that fueled me every day in the too many hours that I was working. And so I just kind of told on myself for a period of time, forgetting I'm in this group of, people who could fire me and everything. And I got to the end of it, and I just stopped talking. And I go, wow, I don't know where that come from. And it's just silence. So in a Baptist eternity, it felt from, it was just 1 minute, but there was just silence. Nobody said anything. And finally, one of our elders said, this is a holy moment. And then another one, she said, we should just pray for a little while here. So people started praying, and it was a time of meeting God. And I remember when I was doing my stream of consciousness, when I finished, and in that silence, I think I've had 3 or 4 of these things in my life where I felt like God spoke to me. His voice was kind of clear. I mean, promptings and all that other stuff, obviously more often, but this kind of felt substantial. But the phrase that came to me is, okay, Kent, but we're going to be done with that now. That kind of thing. We're going to be done with that. And so consumerism became the lens that we began to look at the church with, and we realized that we were feeding that monster. And that in order to teach people how to experience the transformation of Jesus in the details of our lives, we would have to unteach people the very things that we taught them by drawing them to the church and keeping them at the church, which after a while you begin to go, oh my goodness. Now, I do want to say, and I've been faulted by this, and for very good reason, and every chance I get, I make an apology for this and confess my sins in this. Because the reaction to our changes were so difficult, we'll get into that in a second. And there was a season of disillusionment that I had. And my talking sometimes, even my speaking at times, tended to minimize or trivialize the very real experiences that people had during those seeker days. People's came to Christ. People's marriages were saved and beautiful things had happened. And my way of kind of, my burn it down energy at that point was disrespectful. And so I just wasn't I don't know how to say it, a good enough person at that point, hadn't grown sufficiently, I think, to have a sense of that. So that's kind of where we were. Some of the dominoes, the first domino that fell was the whole gospel. I think many of these large church leaders and secret church leaders and such are extremely strategic individuals, have strategy as a kind of gifting of theirs. But it's strategy based on a very unformed and truncated understanding of the good news. I think if people recognize that the good news is about the king is here and is inviting us to live fully in his kingdom, which means submission to his lordship, his rule over us, and then we having to orient our lives so that we are actually growing in that and orient the church's structure. If a person is strategic with that larger, more robust picture of the gospel, the good news, they're going to put a church together that's different than the consumer model and the prevailing model. That's why I think that domino of the getting the gospel right is crucially important. Actually, our elders and some of our staff, we just did the personal journey of going through the entire New Testament. And every time we get the word gospel, we'd write out the context around it and what it meant. And just that exercise causes to, rethink things, pretty severely. The prevailing model church, I use that term a lot and it's used by many. It's a little kinder than saying the traditional model or the legacy model or whatever. You use a pejorative term. The prevailing model is it's kind of has a double meaning. It's like the prevailing model is like, this is the model that prevails, now. And the other way of looking at it, yeah, this is the model that prevails, kind of a thing. And so so you have that, but the prevailing model is essentially a church that's oriented around Sundays and the various programs that emanate from that, the children's ministry, high school or youth ministries, men's ministry, children's ministries, other things that we do. But really the orientation is around that Sunday service, the gathering, and we hire staff to make sure that those programs are run well. And so the mission, although no one would say this out loud, the mission by default becomes the church, building the church. And discipleship becomes assimilation into the life and programs of the church. And so you're wearing the jersey and you're quote unquote discipled if you go to church a lot and you are volunteering in the ministries and you are, showing up at neighborhood outreaches where everyone's all hands on deck and volunteering at the bounce house and all these other things, which are all good and wonderful. But you can volunteer at a bounce house for 40 years and still be the same person you were 40 years ago.
I think of just those assumptions going into what a church is, what the gospel is, and then how that affects expectations of either what people are showing up for or what people who are on staff are, quote, paid to do. All those assumptions. Like I think of when our approach is a consumer approach towards the faith, and so the congregation has a pastor that supplies religious goods and services that we consume, then the job description of a pastor becomes what Stanley Hauerwas called a quivering mass of availability. So,
wait, that's awesome. A quivering mass of availability?
Yes.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, so it's just whatever people are coming looking for. Hey, the pastor should.
Who's ever listening to that, write that down, and that's your takeaway from today. So,
and I think of when that's the expectation, that ministry is something that a few paid people do, rather than this is something we're all called to be involved in, and less of a show. Then once you start realizing that that's not what Jesus is calling the church into, and you start doing things differently, you have the expectations of everybody else. And then you're trying to follow into the way of Jesus. And I think in your book, I remember a quote that you shared from Eugene Peterson of a consumer church does not line up with the kind of deny yourself call that Jesus invites us into. And so a consumer church actually becomes an anti-Christ church. It's anti the way that Jesus is calling
Right.
us. And so there's those mix of expectations. And also another Peterson quote that I'm reminded of is being a pastor is letting people down at a rate they can handle. Um, and I don't know, I've enjoyed that quote. I don't know if I agree with the last part at a rate they can handle. Like, that's not always been my experience because, yeah, everybody's looking for numbers, big programming, give us or give other people what they want. And then you're like, no, we're called to actually something else. So you and your leadership discover that. And the call to spiritual formation, you have this vision of the gospel that is now more robust, and you start ministering to a congregation who came in with those other assumptions.
Right.
What was that like for you? And what things did you see that needed to change for Oak Hills during that time?
Yeah, there's a contract. It's an unspoken contract that the leadership, pastor leaders have with the congregation. It's here's what we provide, this style, this thing, this stuff, this vibe. And people will then, okay, if you provide that, I'll support that with my attendance and my volunteering and my money and those kinds of things. We broke that unspoken contract. Remember, this event happened, this God encounter happened with our senior leadership staff and our elder board. So these are the people who kind of, you know, had a larger picture, particularly the elder board and myself and Mike, larger picture where the church was going, and then the staff that was by and large given the job to deliver on those goals, that direction. And so, me being the founding pastor, I just had this. I think all of us had a kind of naivete about how everyone is going to be thrilled to do this. You know, we came back from the retreat. What do we say happened? You know, we decided we want to orient the church more around the way of Jesus. So people go, what the hell have we been doing up till now then? So I get that. And it's like, so go on. Okay, I'm for that. Who's going to be against that? And so, but the thing that happened is that the energy that it takes to do the seeker model church, and not just a seeker kind of sign, the prevailing model church that's growing and wants to be bigger, you just have to always have the next thing. You always you have to. One of my elder friends, he would say, Carlson, it's time to give the speech again, which is just another vision cast. You know, and Hybels would always say vision leaks, so you have to continually cast vision. And coming back from that, it had a little, this whole definition of a pastor is disappointing people at a rate they can handle. I think I agree with you. It's just disappointing people, you know. And I began to think, well, if I have to continually prop this stuff up artificially by win one for the Gipper speech, then when is it ever real? Or is it just propped up by the, you know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain kind of thing? And so I think that stuff got to us, and the energy that goes into the kind of church that we were doing. We had a slogan, so embarrassing, but our slogan was "You'll be surprised," and it was on everything we wrote. It had cool font on it. You'll be surprised. And the horrible thing about that is, okay, we surprise them, but now we got to surprise them again next week. Now we got to surprise them again next week. And if you're always being surprised, that's just dumb. And it's just, you can't do it. It takes something out of you. When is it just real? Why are we coming? I mean, are you not going to come anymore if we stop surprising you? If we just get up, come together next week and we spend a half hour in silence and read scripture, will you do that 3 weeks in a row and you got to exodus from your church.
Mm.
So I started moving away, Mike as well, from this whole CEO model of leading to a much more, spiritual director, spiritual guru kind of thing, even though we hardly knew anything. But we were trying to live into that. And that, that was tough. People felt that vibe difference. And then with that, in the typical Willow Creek model, we had a Wednesday or Thursday night midweek what's called New Community, where the believers gathered, those who are interested in discipleship. And that was a big gathering. And then we had the Sunday for the seekers. And in some way, they're two different churches. The whole goal in that is all the people who come on Thursday night, they're bringing their friends on the weekend services. And but I was in charge of the weekend services. Mike was in charge of New Community, and I kept moving the weekend services to more to look like New Community because I just wasn't as excited about the entertainment aspect of it, even though I'm an entertainer. Just didn't juice me up like it used to.
Mhm.
And so then we said, well, we're being a little redundant here, and people's lives are so busy. Let's just put New Community on Sunday, and we'll cancel the midweek thing. And what we did is we took away two things that people loved and who were loyal to, and replaced it by one thing that satisfied nobody. And so that kind of thing happened. We weren't doing message series anymore about 6 ways to a fair proof your marriage, or how to the care and feeding of your teenager, or what would Jesus say to Donald Trump, and those kinds of things that you just did that were very popular in those days. Yeah, all the sermons began to be more and more similar, like trying to kind of pay attention to what's going on inside yourself. You've got this number 8 reaction to this number 4 infraction, that 4 differential, that's you. What's underneath that? Let's pay attention to the fear and insecurities and inadequacies and all that stuff. And we were asking people to do things that they had never signed up for. It wasn't a requirement in initiation into the church. Whatever we stated, the invitation was come and watch, and we'll entertain you, and we'll make sure that you're satisfied. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing. You think historically over the whole history of the millennia of the church, there was a time, and there's obvious terrible failings in this, where how was it said, the church holds the keys to heaven. The salvation lies in the church. And so people had to do a lot of work to stay in the good graces of the church, because the church, this is whether you go to heaven or hell or something like that. That's so flipped now in the prevailing model church, that now churches have to stay in the good graces of the people who are coming,
Mhm.
or they'll just go down the street to somebody else. There was a church in our area. They put out a postcard once that said, we have over 50 ministries to meet your particular lifestyle needs. And it's just something you'd see Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount saying, right? Uh, and so it was. So we're facing all that stuff, and then I think another aspect of it, I touched on this before. There was a disillusionment. I'll speak for just myself, and Mike would echo this as well. I just wasn't a good enough person. When someone throws a hand grenade at you, if you're really brave and kind and love people, you throw yourself on the hand grenade so no one else gets hurt. I would just pick them up before it blew up and throw it back. And so it became yeah. So my file of nasty letters and emails was growing.
Mhm.
And I say this purposely, we were not good enough people at that point to handle that as Christ would. And so some people have said, why didn't you go slower? And I'm going, I couldn't do that every week again. I couldn't try to surprise people every week. Now, the retreat happened 2000, and our highest attendance was 2001, and the mass exodus started in 2002. We had all these opinion leader meetings and stakeholder meetings. I know about change and power and conflict and those kinds of things, and how you have to include people in it. So in my mind, we're going excruciatingly slow. But it wasn't until people actually felt some things different. And the abstract discussions are great. Yeah, we want to follow Jesus more. And so when the run on the bank happened, now you're just in survival mode for a while, trying to figure out how to pay for this big building we built, this huge staff we built, um, and we survived. I think after about 10 years, there was a sufficient DNA change, And then a kind of stability came in, and we had adjusted things accordingly financially and such, that we brought back to kind of stability. It was at that point where we even talked about viability, even at that point. Is it going to go under? But we got back to that. And that's when we wrote the book. We wrote it mostly for our church to kind of have a history of what it went through. Also, we wanted to close that chapter. We didn't want to continually talk about the last 10 years because people were tired of that. And all these people had come who loved what we were doing. They're tired of talking about, the past. Let's talk about this cool stuff that's happening. And so that was that.
And now the irony of you write that book and then you get interviews like this where you keep talking about it.
Yeah, it's funny, Matt, you'd love this. I got asked to speak at this Lutheran church out in Nebraska once, and they had read our book and they were going through some things through in their church, and they asked us to come out. I was the only one who could come out. And so I spent a weekend with them, and they had during a Saturday or something, they had this service. I think I spoke on the Sunday service, but I was in this retreat with them, and they had this service where they were essentially doing Lectio Divina, but with our book. And so they would read passages of it, and then they'd sit in quiet and reflect and have a discussion. And I remember thinking, if Mike was there, we would not be able to not to keep from laughing, but the funny thing is, all three of the passages that they read were stuff Mike had written, and so I didn't even get included in it.
Oh man. Well, yeah, I feel like as I've read through it and read through it with students as well, and I'm just like, there are so many pieces that stick out to us that continue to not only be something that you went through then, but also that churches continue to go through and have to keep an eye on. And thinking of consumerism as one of those things, but what other practices or just other things that form us do you think is important for the church to pay attention to today, whether it would form us in a healthy way or also malform us in an unchristlike way?
Well, I think it's from the malformation thing. I think it would be good for all leaders to be recognizing how much consumerism plays into how we do things. And the more difficult thing is how much ambition plays into it by us. I have found that it's easier to get pastors to talk about their lust than it is their sexual lust than it is about their ambition, because there's something dark and admitting that. And not just those who like quote unquote make it in the game, but those who live disappointed lives because they're not as impressive as they wish they would. So I think paying attention to that stuff is important. Ambition, but I'm one of the, and I say this with awkwardness because any critique of people like Dallas Willard and such is like blasphemous. But I think there is in the spiritual formation, quote unquote, movement, there has been for a long time a huge emphasis on the individuality of it. That in places like Renovation, they just worked with individuals and churches. They actually did not have a high ecclesiology from my perspective. And so they had this, maybe never by teaching, but by default in practice, you kind of get this idea that spiritual formation is an individual act. And your culture forms you more than any individual thing that you do. If you're in a unkind, unloving, inhospitable church, and you're spending all this time in solitude and reading scripture, I mean, that'll have an effect on you, but the church you're in is going to have a bigger formative effect. And so I find it interesting that the early church, this is from Alan Kreider's book, Patient Ferment of the Early Church. They didn't even do evangelism. There was no talk about personal evangelism. They took what Jesus taught, and their church was oriented around teaching people how to love your enemies, how to bless those who curse you, those kinds of things. And it was how to become a certain kind of person, because at the end of that, you become a certain kind of community. And then that community has a place, a presence in the community of a beautiful group of people who are just having an alternative way of living that's attractive and beautiful. I don't even know how to do personal evangelism anymore. I don't do it. if I'm in conversation, I'll obviously talk to people about Jesus and things, but it's the biblical model in my mind is come join us in this community of people who are seeking to follow God together, which which means that you have to have this community that's becoming beautiful and alternative. I hesitate to say this because it can sound kind of mean or unkind, but there's a bunch of churches that if I invited people to, they would not learn how to follow Jesus better. They would follow Jesus worse than they maybe had been before they went to church, because of the consumerism, because of the politicizing of things, because of the malformation. I think just even things like Christian nationalism. You coming in and we begin to think of our Christianity as the kind of synchronism that has happened in America between patriotism and Christianity. It's kind of hard to look at that without saying what in the world has happened. So when I think of practices, the church, first off, just the fact that the church is not just a means to an end. It's the experience of the community together that is formative, and our formation together in community. So all formation should be thought of communally. I am a big proponent in making advances 1 millimeter at a time in the area of what many call micro churches or missional communities. I don't have the burn it down energy I used to have anymore, and I'm glad, and I think people around me are glad. Whenever I'm involved in the church and I go to a church, I just see unbelievably beautiful people. That's what's predominant. Yeah, they're the other types, but by and large, the sincerity, the innocence, the goodness, the love, the sacrificial living, all this stuff, it's just there. It's surprising because it's almost against the system, but it's there. Now it doesn't predominate because the system is so strong and the leaders are hired to. The leader's job is to keep the machine going, keep feeding the monster, and that's tough. And more people are saying, I didn't sign up for this, so I think that's a good thing. So, but instead of tearing down that, we're trying to, like we tried to do, change the whole thing. I'm much more oriented around experiments. So you need that kind of apostolic vibe in the church where people say, we send people get called by God and they can move to Africa. Why can't we get like 6 couples in our church to get called by God to move together into this one neighborhood and help everyone do it? The church makes a big fund to a big offering to buy up some homes in there and help people get in there. And then that neighborhood becomes, the mission. Because I think the beauty of the microchurch or the missional community is that it has a shared mission. People often talk about this formation. People would always say formation is more important than mission because if you're not formed, you don't have anything to share. And I get the point, but I think it's much more like the two wings on an airplane. It's silly to talk about which one is most important. And you can't even separate them. There's no way to do mission without being formed, and there's no way to do formation without mission. So it's silly to talk about them separately almost. But I think what really helps is when a community of faith who are diving deeper down into their love for each other, practicing hospitality with each other and with people in the neighborhood who every kid in that family, their pictures are on everybody's refrigerator. It actually becomes this family. You can't do that with 2,000 people. You can't do it with 400 people. You can do it with 20 people, 25 people, 30 people, 40 people. So creating those experiments, which in my estimation, 7 out of 10 will fail, but in baseball, that gets you in the Hall of Fame. And so you just have to have a multiple of that. And one of the problems we have, there are so many people who are upset by this, but they don't realize, and this is sometimes many of everyone from millennials down through Gen Z, they don't realize necessarily how much they've been actually shaped by this consumer church. So they think of the church as something different than them. And they come to church and what they like that there's coffee there. They like that there's a children's program. They like that there's a youth program. They like that the worship leader creates a cool environment and the pastor's good. there's parking for them and restrooms are clean and, that kind of stuff. And they don't have to worry about all those things. But they're complaining about the church for good reason, But it's kind of standing in the back and throwing a stone. And like when I say, well, I get that, I agree with you. Let's go plant a church. And I go, we could just do it like Saturday night. And I go, no, I don't. Saturday, I kind of want to keep that open in case my friends want to get together, that kind of stuff. And so I'm thinking, okay, we're not going to do this with that. We need to get some of that, whatever that stuff is. It causes people to move to India. We need kind of that stuff. And at the very least, we can take small groups and infuse them with mission together, more time together, less responsibilities at the mothership, and motherships and pastors who are enthusiastic about that and give space and create that and talk about it. It really doesn't happen without leaders of churches pushing it. I think there's a book that came out in the 80s. It's still kind of popular. I'm finding out. Is it The Sacred Journey or whatever it is? It's about the stages of faith. Mm-hmm. And so you have these 6 stages of faith. I won't go into them, but the first 3 stages are kind of like initiation into the church, kind of getting involved and then serving. And that's what churches are oriented around. And that's what they're good at. But people get to that 3rd stage and they hit this wall, and maybe they'll then, hit that wall and they'll start over again with a MAGA type church, or they'll start over again with a progressive type church. But they still go through these same patterns. And to grow past that, your orientation isn't around the building of the church. It's orienting around mission, my life with God. I have to learn how to handle suffering. I have to learn contemplative prayer. I have to go deeper in my relationships with people. And churches notoriously are not structured and built around helping people to do that. And so I think, with notable exceptions, of course. So I think that's we if we're not so enamored about growing the church, can we then take some of that energy and be enamored about experiments of microchurches, missional communities that are on mission together? And in that mission together, we are being shaped into the image of Christ. I regularly chat with people who are feeling really dry in their Christian life and they're wanting to know what's next. And I say, you should hang around poor people. Mm-hmm. Just hang out with marginalized people. Realize and do it with a mutuality. You don't have anything to give them. They have gifts to give you. But you're absorbed into this consumeristic, I'll serve you, make sure your needs are met kind of stuff. And of course, you're going to get spiritually dry in an environment like that. Mm. Sorry for all the rambling. So
no, I love it. I feel like I just so enjoy talking with you and that vision that you give of not just a bunch of individual relationships with God, but calling us into the reality that the scriptures inviting us into, of a community that actually first and foremost is living together under the way of Jesus, and that this actually is what shines. And so I just appreciate all your insight, your experience, and for you sharing it with us all this morning.
Yeah, my pleasure.